Welcome to day 2 of my fall or autumn watercolour challenge. So today we're going to be painting a horse chestnut, or what we call in the UK a conker. When I was a kid, we used to string these onto pieces of string and then try to hit each other's conker. We used to swing them and try and knock the other person. We normally ended up getting the other person's knuckles, sometimes a little bit on purpose. And eventually they were banned from UK schools because heaven forbid anybody get a bruised knuckle. But children still love to gather these. My own daughter brought so many of them home. I mean, literally hundreds. And we had them in bowls all around the house until they went mouldy. It really is a fantastic and interesting tree. So we're going to paint a conker today, actually with its little case. I think you're really going to enjoy it. And if you're wondering what the challenge is all about, then we're doing a challenge every day this week. Doesn't matter if you're watching this video in 2 years' time, you can still take the challenge. And it's going to be a watercolor fall-based subject every single day. Now, this challenge is free in that there is nothing else. There are only YouTube videos and they all are free. However, there are extra materials and there's a small $5 admin charge for those just because it takes me weeks to put these things together. So if you want the accompanying PDFs, and each one contains a colour list, it contains colour swaps, so if you don't have the same paints as me, you can swap others in. It will also give you the photograph, it will give you a black and white version of the photograph so you can see the tones. It will also give you a tracing. Now, I don't normally do tracings because I'm a big fan of drawing, but we're just concentrating on the painting this week. So if you're new to drawing, you're not confident of your ability to draw these, you'll be able to use that tracing. But of course, if you're more experienced, I do encourage you to draw this horse chestnut, this conker as well. You'll find all the details in the video description, and it's not $5 a day, it's just $5 for the whole thing. As I said, it just covers my admin expenses. And let's get on and paint today's super interesting subject. So here's today's photograph. So we've got these conkers here, or horse chestnuts, in their cases, and this case lying here, which I think is quite nice. We're also going to put shadows in. Now, I had to lighten this a little bit because my printer never wants to do what it's told. It always prints too dark, but the shadows do show quite a bit, as you'll see probably from the photo I put on screen. Hopefully it shows. Anyway, you'll see me paint them in this video. Now, on the tracing in the PDF, I've actually put some dotted lines for where the shadows go. I do suggest, unless you're really not confident about putting them in the right place, and they don't have to be exact, I suggest you don't put dotted lines in like this. I've just done this so that you can see roughly where the shadows go. It's always best to avoid drawing around shadows if you can, because if the pencil is left behind, it always looks a bit uncomfortable. You'll get away with it much more on these darker objects. Now, the horse chestnuts themselves, the conkers themselves, are shiny, and so I want to get a couple of highlights, and I've placed the highlights here and here. I'm going to use masking fluid so that I can block these out. Don't worry if you don't have any. You can just paint carefully around those areas. So let's do that first. So I've just put a tiny amount of this schminky masking fluid out. It's a white one, it will dry clear, so likely you won't see it very much on camera. I'm going to use, let's use this end. I'm just using an embossing tool to apply it with, and going to keep it sort of with a fairly raggedy edge, and then we'll allow that to dry. It'll take 5 or 10 minutes. It always remains tacky, but once it's dry, we'll be able to start painting across the top, and we don't have to worry about reserving those highlights anymore. Now, in some of this week's tutorials, I'll be choosing the colours as I go along, but I think I've pretty much chosen here. So I've got this sap green, and it's pretty good, isn't it? It's pretty good. It's a little lighter in places. I may add some yellow in, I'm not sure yet, but we'll start with this one. Now, I've swatched another one here. So this one is by Jackman's Art Materials, who I work with in the UK. This is Winsor & Newton. So this one is still a lovely colour, but it's bluer. So if you are using a sap green, you may need to adjust your sap green and pop a little yellow in. In fact, looking at the amount of yellow around this side, I think I'm probably going to grab some kind of cadmium yellow light to add to this mix as well. And then I've got 2 browns. You can of course mix a green from scratch if you like to mix your own greens. I would probably try something like a phthalo or a Prussian and a mid to warm yellow. So I've got 2 browns in here. I've got this one, which is a beautiful burnt sienna. This one's by Jackman's. And then I've got a sepia, which is by Talon's Rembrandt, which is this much colder dark brown. Now, it may be if you have a very basic set of watercolors that you don't have either of these colors, but I pretty much guarantee that you'll have a burnt umber, and you can adjust your burnt umber. So you can add some ultramarine to make it darker and cooler like this. It'll just granulate a little bit more, but that's fine. And then you can add a little bit of red or orange to lighten it and get a brighter shade of warm brown for the actual conkers themselves. The other thing I'll be using is this dark brown watercolor pencil to get some of those fine line details. So as always with watercolors, we want to go light to dark. So what I want to do first of all is get these very pale areas, like around here. Now I could take a very pale wash across this whole thing because there's nothing in the colour of the conkers themselves that is really darker or brighter than that. We've already reserved our white highlights. When it comes to this green shell here, I don't want to take my pale wash across all of that because it'll mean that the greens are less bright, but I will just pop some colour into this little slither down here where we can see the inside of the shell. All I'm going to do in this case is just water down this colour. And really this is quite flexible. You could use a variety of browns for this. If you've got a raw umber, you could certainly water that down. That's already a fairly weak colour. So I'm going to start down here and I'm going to take this across everything just to knock out the brightness. And there's actually a hint of green on this one. So I'm just going to get the tiniest touch of green, and we are going to work further into these areas, of course. But at this stage, I'm just going to add a little green in just to add some interest. It's looking a little dark. So with a cleaned damp brush, I can lift out any highlights, any areas that I think are going to need to be lighter, which is mostly this area around here. I'm also going to take this pale wash across this whole area here and into this little slither. Now, it's been just a second of editing snip for you, but I've been away from my board for about 3/4 of an hour. It's really important once you've put this first layer on that it's bone dry, because we're going to paint next to these areas and we don't want it to bleed in. So don't be fooled by thinking that, you know, we're going straight in. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to put some of the colour on here. Now, it would be possible to do all of this in one paint layer. We can put the green in, we can drop the brown in, we can do all of the things. But the thing is, I tend to find that it does look rather flat if you do that. And if you've got an object that looks very opaque and very solid, as these things do, then layering really helps. So we're going to start out with our green and yellow. I'm just going to start layering up. Let's just put some paint on like this, keeping it quite light and bright, not worrying about all of those browns at the moment, just thinking about where the lighter areas of the green are. I'm going to go straight in with some yellow over here, and I'm going to start building up. There's a highlight on this one over here. It's not sharp like the others, so we didn't reserve it, but I'm going to lift it out with a clean, partially dried brush, and I want to go darker around here. So going in with some paint that's much thicker, and in that way we control it so that it doesn't bleed further up. If you go on top with wet paint, you'll get all sorts of bleed runs happening. You don't have too long to work on this, and it does depend on, you know, the temperature where you're working. I'm also going to start going across this side here, because again, if I wait, then this would bleed in here and leave a drying line. So I'm just going to take this across here. Now, it's pretty obvious the light is coming from that left-hand side, so I'm just going to drop a bit of lightness and yellow in there. Now I'm going to leave that first layer to dry. Whilst the green is drying, I'm going to work on the case of this conker here. So we're going to put another layer on top. Now, even if you're happy with any of the areas of this, we need to re-wet it so that we don't get hard edges. So I'm going to start by putting some clean water on. Now I'm going to drop in some of my warm colour here, and there's a little up here. With any of these subjects, don't stress with getting them, you know, identical to what you're looking at, because it'll make your painting so slow that everything starts to dry, and then you get drying lines and nothing works. I'm going to go in with the much darker colour down here and just allowing a little bit of bleeding to happen. Whilst it's still wet, I'm now going to go in and make some of those finer lines with my watercolour pencil. Now, there is a way of making the pigment bleed out to the edges here, But just to keep this tutorial simple, we're going to use this watercolor pencil. And you see I'm just getting these dark areas in. If you need to manipulate anything or lift anything out, use a brush that's almost dry and clean. And try not to mess around with it for too long. There is a line here of very dark shadow just inside here, but we're going to do that after this first layer is dry. So this is dry again, and you see why we let things dry. Look how much lighter and duller everything looks, and that's simply because watercolors dry so much lighter than we put them on. Even this one here, I now feel that it needs a little more, so I'm going to go back in again. Whenever you go back in, you want to re-wet the area. Now you can re-wet part of an area, but be aware that water on its own can make a drying line. So if you can, at least stop that somewhere where a line wouldn't look uncomfortable. And I'm going to go in even darker here. We're going to just ramp up this contrast a little bit. Let's put a little more the other side too. I'm going to continue adding a little more colour to certain areas here so that we ramp up this contrast, and then we'll go on to putting the second layer on the green. So I'm going to start just by adding clean water here because I don't want this top part to go much darker. And then I'm going to go in with some green paint so that this whole area is wet again. Not going too dark, but just putting another layer on like this will add to the depth and solidity of this item. And then before it dries, we're going to go in with the brown. I'm going to use the cooler, darker brown, and I'm keeping the paintbrush fairly dry, and I'm just going to dab in some areas like this. Bring this around here as well. Now, these marks at the moment look a little too rounded, shall we say. So I'm going to do some blotting. So I'm going to get some scrunched up paper towel. You need to be careful here that you don't end up transferring any paint to the lighter areas. I'm going to work back in again, put a little over here as well. Now I could do something like splattering, but I think actually I'm just going to use the point of my brush to put a few more marks in. I'm using the lighter brown now. Be careful not to cover up all of the green. The last thing I'm going to do is just get some of those tiny details with my watercolor pencil. We have got a bit of a sort of a center line in places here. Also going to mix a little yellow and green and just highlight that area a bit. That may be enough. I'm going to let it dry and see how it looks. Now, because I didn't paint any water along this edge here, I'm just going to take some very strong dark sepia paint and just come along this edge where there's a little bit of shadow in places. You could do this with a watercolor pencil if you're not confident about painting so neatly. Ideally, I should change to a smaller brush, but I do tend to be rather lazy about these things. At this point, can I just pop in and ask that you not only like this video and give it a thumbs up, but if this is useful for you, I wonder if you could share it with a friend, or perhaps in a Facebook group or WhatsApp group, or just with somebody you think might enjoy doing this challenge as well. Really helps to get more people painting and drawing, and I think that this challenge is actually very suitable for beginners. So don't keep it to yourself, do share it with a friend, and let's get on with the rest of the painting. I feel like this little underneath area here of the green and this area where it joins just doesn't really show enough. So I'm just going to get a little bit of sort of yellow and maybe a hint of brown, drop some of that in. And then I'm going to use my watercolor pencil just to sharpen some of those areas. Try not to completely outline an area. You can always break up, almost like a dotted line, which is going to make things look a lot more natural. Let's move on to painting these two conkers, and before I do the dark brown part, I want to get a little bit more detail on these central parts, these light areas. So what I'm going to do is just apply some water. I'll be careful not to go next to that dark part I've just painted. Now I've put this water on and I'm kind of just lifting some of it out. What I want is for this area to be damp but not fully wet. So you can leave it for a minute or two to dry, because I'd like to get some kind of outward bleeding. I'm going to get some of this brown colour here and just drop it around the outside like this, see if we can get a bit of bleeding going on. It's going to look too dark, but we'll do a little blotting, and also of course it will dry lighter. We can also use a damp clean a dried brush to just get a touch of water or colour to get that circular effect. A couple of little areas of darker paint, really picking up the tiniest amounts on my brush. I'll paint the other one in the same way, except that it's got a little more of the darker brown pigment on. Another thing I've noticed is there's a tiny bit of, it must be a little bit of stem sticking out from the side here. So I'm just popping that in dark brown. Now it's important to let everything get really, really 100% bone dry before we paint these conkers in, because we don't want any of that dark, shiny brown to leak into either these center areas or the outside case. Now, what I'm going to do next is optional and depends entirely on the colours you're using. So I think that this could be a little brighter and a little warmer. So I'm going to glaze it. I also want some darker brown marks on because, as always, they've dried quite light. So what I'm going to do is just mix up some really watery yellow paint. And then without agitating the underneath layer too much, we just take it across the top. This is called glazing, and it just adjusts the colour underneath very slightly. Start on the lightest areas because you don't want to pull any dark paint across into areas where you don't want it. So we'll do the lightest, brightest parts first, taking it right the way across. Then I'm going to use the opportunity of it being wet to drop a little more paint in. Some of these dark marks are slightly hard edged, so I might even put a little more in after it's dry. Next, we're going to paint the conkers. So I'll show you on this one here. They're both really the same process, but this one's got some nice sort of swirly marks on. So what we're going to do is I'm coming in with my burnt sienna and I'm going to take this colour across. We're going right the way across that masking fluid. You see it resisting the paint there. It doesn't matter if paint dries on top of it actually, because it will still erase later. And just spreading this paint around. With a drier brush, I can lift out any slightly lighter areas. Do remember though, it's going to dry lighter than you've applied it. Now I'm going in with very dry, sticky paint. That will enable me to have it stay just where I put it, but with a soft edge. And I'm going to make those lovely swirly shapes. It's more important to work quickly than to obsess over getting them exactly right. Try to go quite dark wherever there's masking fluid. That's going to give you maximum shine at the end. I'm going to paint the other one in the same way, and then we have to let it get very, very dry. So whilst those are drying, as I said, I want to get some slightly harder edge marks on here. It seems to be still wetter than I was expecting, so I may actually let that dry a little bit more. I'm also going to take just a little green paint and tidy up this edge here. Once everything's dry, we'll remove the masking fluid, and the last thing we're going to do is add some shadows. So let's do our shadows. Now, my paint is still a little wet, but I can do this shadow down here because it's not touching the center part, it's only touching where there is wet paint. So I'm going to just take these pencil lines as fine as possible. What you need at this point is 2 water jars, and they must be full of clean water. And you'll also need a rag or a cloth in order to control the water on your brush. I've put this new colour out. So this is called Petal Shadow, and this is a colour that I designed with Jackman's. If you want to mix something like this, take some cerulean pigment, pop in the tiniest amounts of pink and something like lemon until you get a soft lilac grey like this one. An alternative colour would be a Davies grey. Now you can use something like a Payne's grey, water it down. The difficulty with using those stronger colours is you have to put a lot of water on, and then you're battling with very watery paints. So let me show you the method. So I'm going to take clean water, and what I'm doing is I'm taking it much further out than the shadow is. You want to take it about double as far out as the area where the shadow is going to sit. Make sure that round the sides it's just touching right up to your object. Be careful you don't make the paint bleed. But around the main part here, I'm putting it close to but not touching the object, and that's because you can't easily tell where you're putting water. So now we're going straight in with paint, and the paint on my brush is fairly dry and fairly sticky. The more drippy it is, the further it's going to spread, and I'm taking it up around here where it meets our object, and then you want to bring it out. You'll naturally have less paint on your brush. You can also clean and dry your brush. If it's spreading too much or is bleeding in a way you don't like, just take a damp brush around. You see this colour is separating into sort of pinks and greys. That's because it's made with granulating pigments. I quite like. Don't mess around with it too long. Once you're happy with it, leave it alone. If it dries too light, you can always put another layer on, but it's never a good idea to mess around with watercolours when they're damp. Once the rest of my paints are dry, I'm going to add my other shadows in. I might just pop a little clean water in the centre here, just get 1 or 2 more marks with the watercolour pencil. This is your time to make any final adjustments. I'll put a picture up at the end so you can see how it turns out. Oh, and of course, I forgot to mention we'll also remove the masking fluid. Wait till everything's bone dry and then rub it off gently, either with your finger or with an eraser, remembering that even dry paint can smudge if you handle it too roughly. So let me know in the comments what you think of this subject. You're going to have a go yourself. Don't forget to pop into the video description. That will tell you where you can download the accompanying PDFs if that's something you would like to do. I'll also link all of the videos down in the video description. I mean, once they're up, obviously if you're watching this the day it came out, then the rest of the week won't be up yet. But once all of the videos are out, I'll link them all in the video description so you can access all 5 days really easily. Don't forget to share with a friend, and you can watch another one of my videos right now.